Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matthew Barber. I will be giving a lecture on an area that is pretty far away from New Mexico, but I think has a lot of relevance. And we're going to be talking about the early modern era as it relates to Islam in the East. So the areas not only adjacent to Europe, but the areas even further afield, including the Indian subcontinent. This talk is actually one of my favorite talks because it actually involves some of my favorite characters from history. While I tend not to be a big fan of nobility, I tend to love people that that I feel like I fully understand in life. And there's several figures here I completely feel that I understood where they were coming from. This concept of gunpowder empires has actually been around for quite a while. In fact, it's important to note that well, we tend to think of many Islamic countries as behind the West today. In the early 16th century, Islam or the Islamic empires really adopted firearms on a massive scale well before Europeans did. So last time we were talking about how Spain adopted firearms and how that changed the course of European history. Today we're going to be talking about how their neighbors adopted them. And really, there's three gunpowder empires that are often referred to. The westernmost is, of course, the Ottoman Turks or the Ottoman Empire. Where Iran is today is the Safavid Empire, and then over on the far east is the Mughal Empire. And you can see those all here, just kind of in a quick vision of how these empires relate to the world. The term of gunpowder empires was initially brought up by a man by the name of Marshall Hodgson and his partner William McNeill. They used the idea of gunpowder empires to explain the emergence of three highly organized Islamic states. All of these empires kind of emerged out of areas that at that point had been dominated by loosely confederated Turkic and Mongol nations. So these are the nations that appear in places where traditionally there were not necessarily large states. And then they expanded to conquer areas that were often viewed as much more civilized. And I use that word loosely, but it's a very important part of the concept. These gunpowder empires were the first, and I do want to make this clear, not just the first Islamic states, but the first states in the entire world to establish permanent troops trained in the handling and manufacturing of firearms. Now, other nations such as Poland and Muscovy, and even the Khanate of Kazan had all used firearms amongst their soldiers prior to this time. But these empires, these empires further south and further east, really focused on making the gunpowder soldier the principal unit to their armies. And this technological superiority allowed them to consolidate power and expand rather rapidly. And all of this is going to get into a broader discussion of where we are with Islam today. While I am not a religious scholar, what I'm going to try to do is give you a very good explanation as to why the Sunni and Shia world do not like each other today. And while those arguments date back to religious matters, they really come to a head in the early modern era. Okay, so our lecture goals. First of all, we're going to examine those three empires, those Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals in some detail. But we're going to focus primarily on the 16th and 17th century. So even though these empires may have extended past that time period in some cases, we're not going to necessarily deal with those later periods. So I'm not going to deal with British colonization of India, for example, and how that caused the Mughal decline. I'm also going to try to touch on, well, I think the notion and concept of gunpowder empires is very good and very compelling. There was other important contemporary Islamic states, and I'm going to try to touch upon some of those later in the lecture, just to give you a broader survey as it was of Islam in the modern world. Okay, so the first one we have to talk about is the Ottoman Empire. This is the Ottoman Empire at perhaps its greatest extent in 1683. This is around the same time as the siege of Vienna. If you'll notice, the Ottoman Empire is largely focused on the area that we know today as Anatolia, which we would call Turkey. as well as Greece. Now, the Ottoman Empire is also the strangest of the empires because the Ottoman state actually starts as a medieval state. It starts around 1300 AD. It's actually created out of the collapse of the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks had been a Persianized Turkish people that invaded Anatolia. Perhaps the most famous thing you know them for is the Battle of Manzikert, in which they beat the Roman Empire, the Byzantine forces. That defeat by the Greek speaking Romans was to cause the First Crusade. Remember, the Byzantines actually go west and ask the Pope to help them. This all caused by the Seljuk Turks, but the Seljuk Turkish state kind of collapses, and in that wake, some of the Seljuks being Muslims, really these frontier warriors start to carve out their own state under Osman the First. This army really is not a matter of just Persianized Turks. Rather, they're Hellenized. They're Romanized, if you were. They've taken on a lot of Byzantine tactics. They rapidly expand, and the Ottoman state looks like it's going to become a major power in the medieval period. It's already starting to get there. And then they lose a horrific battle at Ankara against Tamerlane in 1402. And pretty much it takes some time to rebuild, and then the whole medieval state kind of slows down. The state of the Ottoman Turks, as far as the modern period, really gets started under Mehmed the Conqueror. Mehmed, or Muhammad, was the Sultan of the Ottoman Turks from about 1444 to 1481. You'll notice there's a period in which he isn't the Sultan. He actually tells his dad he has to come back for a short period of time. But Mehmed was interesting in that he was a mix of not only Turkish ancestry, but Slavic ancestry. He conquers Constantinople at the age of 21 and presides over the rapid expansion of the Ottoman Empire into Eastern Europe. He creates a westernized bureaucracy and a central authority residing at the Sultan's court. Of course, he makes Constantinople, then to be known as Istanbul, his capital. After before that, it was Edirne or Adrianople. Mehmed is perhaps the person that can best explain why Turkey is often considered, it's considered a European nation in many ways today. And all of this comes out of a thing very early in his life, and that is the Battle of Varna. So Mehmed is fighting in Eastern Europe in 1444. He's fighting a crusading army of Germans, Hungarians, Poles, Croats, and others that are trying to stop the Ottomans. The battle is won by the Ottoman Turks, but they initially find some setbacks as many of the Poles under King Vladislav III have firearms. These firearms prove pretty dangerous on the battlefield. Now, a Polish gun at this point represents a stick with a small canister on top of it. So it's not necessarily a very impressive weapon, but it proves fairly decisive early on in the battle. And while the Ottomans win the battle, what comes out of it is Mehmed is like, I got to get those weapons. So Mehmed decides that the best way for the Ottomans to compete with these European armies and this European technology is to master it. And so he reforms his army. He actually pays German and Hungarian gunsmiths to come into his kingdom of the Ottoman Empire and start to better equip his troops. They cast not only what are going to be matchlock muskets, but also very large cannons to help the Ottoman Turks in their siege efforts. And we can see one of those cannons here on the right. He also transforms his personal bodyguard, known as the Janissary. The Janissary were primarily Slavic boys taken as slaves by the Ottoman Turks. They were indoctrinated into Islam, and they were his elite guard. Traditionally, up until this point, these young men of initially Christian descent that were converted utilized bows, and they were just more of a formal guard. But under Mehmed, they're given matchlock muskets and grenades, and really taught to be the front lines of the Ottoman Empire. And these Janissaries are the first permanent military group to adopt and train in firearms. They not only use firearms, but they train in them. They learn tactics. They work as a group, a consolidated group. Whereas up to this point, the Polish gunners or the Muscovy gunners were more just kind of mixed in with your archery corps. It's just a catch-all, for example. These guys are really training hard. This advantage of using these Janissaries as your primary shock troops led to a rapid expansion. We see the collapse of the Roman Empire in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. We see the collapse of Greece in 1460, only 17 years later. We see the conquest of the Middle East following shortly behind. And then Egypt, which was the home of the Mamluk Sultanate, a very powerful medieval sultanate in North Africa. Algeria falls, Hungary falls, Rhodes falls, and Crete. Crete actually holds on for a very long period of time. And so good on them for keeping on that. But the collapse of many of these other kingdoms led to the Ottomans becoming the protectors of Islam. The Ottomans were Sunni religion. They worshipped Islam in the way most Sunnis do. And as I said, I'm not going to get into the religious reasons of how Sunni is different from Shia, but just keep in mind that they are one specific branch of Islam. But their conquest actually led to a multi-ethnic state. And it's important to point this out. None of these empires, but of course, in the Ottoman case, it's very much in talking about European. But during this time period, the Ottoman Empire is made up of Muslims. It's made of Jews, and not only Ashkenazi Jews or Eastern Jews, but a huge number of Sephardic Jews. As the Jewish population is being kicked out of Spain, those people are being welcomed in by the Ottoman Sultan and are establishing themselves in Turkey, in Greece, and in other parts of the Ottoman Empire. It's also important to note that they had a very large number of Christian subjects. These include Greek and Slavic Orthodox populations, but also Latin-speaking populations such as the Vlachs of modern-day Romania and Moldova. All of these people lived in the Ottoman Empire, but the most important group that they conquered, and one of and he also, I don't even have this in the slide, but obviously in conquering the Roman Empire, one of the titles the Ottoman Sultan takes is Emperor of Rome. But another title he gets when he conquers Egypt is he becomes the de facto caliph, which means that he is ostensibly, whoever the Ottoman ruler is the head of Islam. He determines what is and is not kosher. Now, mind you, kosher is not probably the right word, but I think you get the idea from that. Perhaps the greatest of these early sultans of the Ottoman Empire is a man known by the name of Suleiman. He's often called Suleiman the Magnificent. He was married to a Ukrainian woman. So remember, his ancestry is both Turkish and Slavic, and he marries a Slavic woman. There is a law. I always point this out because I spend most of my time talking about Eastern Europe. When you're talking about the Ottoman Empire, it's important to note that their ruling class, these heads of Islam, were, God, if you did a family chart, they have a lot of Slavic blood in them. They're almost more Slavic than they are Turkic in many ways. But he was known as the lawgiver, primarily because he refined religious and secular law into a harmonious structure. Whether that's true or not, he's often known as that. He really brought Islamic thinking and modern day traditions of state management together. He was also an amazing patron of the arts, with the Ottoman Turks under Suleiman establishing their own great artistic tradition that extends beyond their Persianized or Hellenized, by that I mean Greek and Persian and Turkic roots. Of course, the end of the Ottomans really comes at the beginning of the end, really starts in the early modern period. That is, of course, at the Battle of Varna. If you'll notice, the Ottoman Empire, we started with a battle with the Poles. In this lecture, at least, we're going to end with a battle with the Poles. The Ottoman Turks should have won Vienna in 1683, but they didn't. And by not reinforcing their camp, the Polish army that came to relieve Vienna was allowed to gather en masse and do one of the last great cavalry charges of what, in essence, is a medieval a cavalry charge of medieval knights. They weren't, they were Polish hussars, but the same concept is they rush down, they defeat the Ottomans in a great victory for Christendom. And it enables the kind of the Christian forces to eventually reconquer Hungary and the Balkans. And it really enters in from 1683 to 1922. You're in a constant state of, unfortunately, Ottoman decline at the hands of largely European benefit. The second empire that we need to talk about. This is the Safavid Empire. This is probably the one you're least familiar with. It's certainly the one I'm least familiar with. Safavid Empire is what we would call modern day Iran. But if you'll notice that the extent of this and all the borders of these three different empires actually extend between each other, because all these empires fought with each other, is modern day Iran. The Safavid Empire actually was established under Shah Ismail the first. He was of Kurd and Greek ancestry with connections to the nobility in Trebizond in Georgia. He was a follower of Shia Islam. And amongst his followers, he was often given a quasi-divine status. He was actually believed that he couldn't be beat in battle, which we're going to see in a second. It's not the case. But he unites the various Turkic tribes living in the area and as well as is able to conquer Azerbaijan, which is a very important Turkic state next to Iran today. They're also the hated enemy of the Armenians, as well as Persia. Interestingly enough, when you talk about the Safavid Empire, it begins with a defeat. In fact, the thing that really kickstarts the Safavids in modern day Iran is the Battle of Childeran. That battle was fought in 1514, and it was a battle in which the Ottomans completely destroyed the Safavids. The Safavids rode as Turkish warriors do on their horses, and their horse archers shot arrow after arrow, and it looked great until the Janissaries opened up with their gunfire, and the Safavids were completely destroyed. And as a result, the Ottomans sacked their capital. The reason this battle was important is because it illustrated, just like it had for the Ottomans in the Battle of Varna, the importance of gunpowder regiments. And of course, the Safavids completely changed tactics. In 1516, they have 8,000 musketeers known as Tafankchi in their army. 5 years later, in 1521, they have 20,000. Their gunpowder regiments are once again their primary stopping power. So, and they mass this firepower. They would put out their wagons. The gunners would hide behind the wagons, and they would just shoot and shoot and shoot. And then, of course, you would still use horse archers to protect your flanks and obviously to pursue the enemy if they retreated. But these gunpowder regiments become very, very important. To make matters worse for the Ottomans, the Safavids decide that their best bet is, the Ottomans are fighting in Germany and Hungary, and the Safavids decide their best bet is to ally with the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. That's the same Charles that we talk about at Coronado, and Louis II of Hungary, and they enter into an alliance. So the Safavids decide that their best allies are the Habsburgs. Remember, the Habsburgs rule Spain, they rule Germany, or large portions of Germany, and as well as Hungary. The Ottoman Turks obviously respond with their own alliance with France. And in essence, what you have is a first buildup of global alliances, with Shia Islam supporting Catholicism to some extent, and the Ottomans supporting Protestants. I know that sounds weird considering I said they're associated with France, but as I said, France was really kind of the backbone of your Protestant defense in Europe during this time period. This was actually the pretext for the Ottomans. These alliances were the pretext for the Ottomans actually conquering Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 and the death of Louis II. So Louis II had to die because he allied with the Safavids, the Persians. Once the Ottoman tactics were adopted by the Safavids, they were utilized on their neighboring kingdoms, not only the Ottoman Turks, but kingdoms further east. And the Safavid Empire actually expands almost as far east as modern-day Pakistan. And in the west, it takes most of Iraq, and it expands almost to Anatolia at certain points in the past. Um, the Safavid was not just a military conquest of a kingdom, but a cultural revolution. Up until this time, most of the populations on the Iranian plateau had pursued Sunni Islam, but the Safavids were diehard followers of 12er Shia. And I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that exactly right. They convert their populations. Moreover, their kingdom becomes a refuge for anybody who practices Shia Islam and or opposes the Ottomans. So lots of different people are coming into the Safavid Empire, primarily because they hate Sunni Islam or they hate the Ottoman Turks. And this leads to a rivalry, and interestingly enough, most of the courts in Europe are quick to recognize the Safavids on equal footing with other European nations. In fact, you'll see many paintings, even in Poland, of Safavid delegations with great honors. It's kind of an interesting take. These guys are shown quite a bit, but they also, this trade and contact with European leads to a level of prosperity for the Iranian peoples that hasn't existed since the Persian Empire. It really is a cultural revolution. And the head leader of this revolution, the guy who kind of hits it at its renaissance, is Abbas the Great. We can see Abbas painted here. He was Shah in the late 1500s, early 1600s. He worked very heavily with the English officials to better train his army and their gunships to help blockade ports. In fact, Abbas would be the one who kicks the Portuguese out of the Persian Gulf. Interestingly enough, he seems very tolerant, from what we gathered from Abbas, and he, unfortunately, I don't think he wrote anything in his own time. He seems to have been very incredibly tolerant of Christians, but he had absolutely no tolerance for his Sunni co-religionists. And the violent acts perpetrated against Sunnis by Shias and vice versa, obviously, was extraordinarily great. These empires are butting right up against each other and have a very similar outlook, both militarily and culturally, even though they've both developed their own unique style or traditions. Unfortunately, the Safavid Empire actually ended in Afghanistan, which is the place where all good and bad empires potentially go to die. I won't comment on our own experiences in Afghanistan, but certainly, obviously recently in our lifetimes, Russia has faced a similar problem in Afghanistan. What happens is the Safavids try to convert the Afghan people from Shia Islam to Sunni Islam. In fact, this goes all the way into, I want to be clear, when you hear people talking about why didn't Iran support Saddam Hussein, not Saddam Hussein, oh my God, Osama bin Laden. Well, part of it is Osama bin Laden was Sunni, and the Iran is a Shia state, which is they never really got along, even though the Afghans are Sunni and on their border, and they have a lot of cultural ties. They're very different religiously. The fall of the Safavids would be when they tried to force the Afghans to convert. The Afghans rebelled, tried to maintain their Sunni way of life, and those same rebellious Afghans actually take the fight to the Safavids, and for a short period of time rule Iran as the Hotak Empire between 1722 and 1738. While the Hotak Empire, and I use those words in quotations there because it's not really an empire, it's very, very short-lived. It doesn't lead to a great Sunni nation establishing itself on the Iranian plateau, but it does destroy the Safavids, and Iran after this point will follow a different trajectory than under the Safavid rule. This is Marwayas Hotak here. Okay, last group, the Mughals. These are my favorites, and I think I have family relation connections to the Mughals, but moreover, I like them primarily because I think I get them in a way that perhaps I don't get many other rulers. This is the Mughal Empire at its greatest extent. I don't remember exactly what year this is. This is probably very the late 1600s, early 1700s that we're looking at in this image spread of the Mughal Empire. Of course, if you look at that, includes in its greatest extent included portions of Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, you name it. It didn't go to Sri Lanka, but it covered most of the Indian subcontinent as well as portions of Central Asia. The last of our groups, the Mughals, was actually established by a guy by the name of Babur. No, that wasn't really his name. His name was Zahruddin Muhammad, but everybody knew him as Babur, which just means the tiger in Persian. He was actually a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. You could not have a greater descendancy if you take the nature argument to how you are in life. He had the perfect nature argument that he was going to be a great conqueror, and that's absolutely what he was. He lived in Central Asia through most of his life. He was a local warlord centered in Kabul, where if I was giving this talk 2 decades ago, probably nobody could identify where Kabul was on a map. But considering the United States' involvement in the Afghanistan war, I think most of us know where Kabul is today in Afghanistan. And he fought with the Safavids and Uzbeks. He was just a local warlord at the time, centered in that city. As part of the Ottoman war against the Shias, they got interested in Babur early on, and they decided to train Babur's group of fighters in the use of firearms, cannons, and so on and so forth, with the hope that if they gave these weapons to Babur and trained him in how to use them, he would put them to work dismantling the Safavid Empire. He does fight the Safavids for at least a couple of years, but he eventually he doesn't make any headway against him, and instead he turns his attention east to the Sultanate of Delhi. He decides to invade India in 1526, and a giant army meets him at the Battle of Panipat. The Sultan of Delhi amasses an army of 150,000. Now, Babur's army, while big at 12,000, is nowhere near as large as the Islamic Indian force that's come out to meet him. But interestingly enough, Babur does exactly what the Ottomans tell him. He lines up his cannons and he fires into their ranks, and all of the Indian elephants get spooked and they run through the battle lines. And then the whole Indian line just starts to collapse, and the Mughal horse archers just tear it apart. In fact, the Sultan actually dies in the battle. As a result, Babur annexes the Sultanate of Delhi, and the Mughal Empire is born. In Babur's own words, he says this of the battle: "By the grace of Almighty God, this difficult task was made easy to me, and that mighty army in the space of half a day was laid in dust." It's also important to note that Babur wrote about his life in great detail in a document that survives with us today called the Baburnama. Now, the Mughals were different from both the empires we've talked about so far. So before, we were looking at one group, the Ottomans, who started as Ghazis, as holy warriors in the service of Sunni Islam. And with the Shias, we found a group that, the Safavids, we found a group of Shias that were diehard for 12 or Shia. The Mughals were pretty ambivalent religiously. They were nominally Sunni, which made them at least nominally subservient to the Ottomans, because the Ottoman Sultan was Caliph, but they really didn't fall in lines with either group. They spoke Persian or Farsi initially and administered their empire in a lot of the same ways the Safavids did. In fact, their primary interest early on was Central Asia. The Indian subcontinent was of lesser importance. In fact, Babur actually mentions in his writings that he really doesn't like India at all. This will come back to haunt him, because his descendants will lose most of India as a result. And it's on his grandson to reclaim the empire Babur started. His grandson's name has a very long name, which is listed there, but he's pretty much known as Akbar, which in Urdu just means the great. Akbar was Shah from 1556 to 1605. So he had a very long life. He was almost in charge of things for 50 years. And he reconquers almost he not only reconquers all the land that's lost to the Mughals in India, he actually expands the empire a lot, primarily at the loss of the Rajputs in central India during that time period. And he, unlike his grandfather, who was nominally Sunni, he actually almost takes on a quasi divine status, similar to Ishmael did earlier in time. He kind of there's some debate about this today. I mean, people want to complain, well, he was Islam, he was Sunni, but he also took on aspects of Zoroastrianism, which was the traditional religion of Persia, the pre-Islamic religion of Persia, as well as other faiths. And in fact, he kind of wrapped it all up into his own cult, which is sometimes known as Din-e-al-Halhi. And I'm sorry, I'm not saying that correctly. There's a lot of different languages being spoken here, and me pronouncing a lot of these things is just subject to fail. But he unites the people kind of behind his own thing. He's incredibly tolerant of other religions, and kind of in doing this kind of quasi-divine status, he kind of, when he takes pieces of different religions, he gives everybody an opportunity to say, well, he's not delegitimizing what I believe. He's taking a little bit of what I believe and putting it into himself. So it made people a lot more likely to get behind Akbar than Babur. He also loved hunting on a level that is perhaps only exceeded by his own son, Jahangir. He actually most famously trained 2 cheetahs as his hunting dogs and loved to ride elephants. In fact, he rode elephants to fight other elephants. He was a pretty interesting dude. In fact, he had elephants that he gave large amounts of wine to, and I could probably give a whole lecture on just why Akbar was such a strange and interesting individual. But Akbar, well, Akbar's faith does not survive him. Later, Mughals are just Sunni Islamists. His tolerance and intermingling of faiths in India really does. He really creates a multicultural state with the Mughal Empire. The language of the rulers evolves from Persian to Urdu, which is a Persianized form of Hindustani. And he brings into his court not only Islamic peoples, but Maharathas, Rajputs, Pashtuns, Hindu, Jats, Sikhs, and others. All are given places of authority in his Mughal administration. And unlike the Portuguese, who actually arrived before them, the Mongol Turkic newcomers are actually accepted as part of India. I mean, in fact, when you go and dine at a Indian restaurant in Albuquerque, the most likely things you are to see in those restaurants are iconography of the Mughal Empire. In fact, here's one of Akbar riding one of his elephants right here. I don't remember which elephant he's riding in this one. I do have it in a different presentation, exactly which elephant this is. I want to say it's Hanwat or something close to that. He loved to train elephants, and he rode them, and he thought it was he was every way an Indian boy. The emperors serve as patrons of the art. This is, of course, the time period in which we get the Taj Mahal that you see here. Most of the greatest architectural achievements and the achievements that you go, oh my God, I'm going to India to see X, Y, or Z. Many of them were built by the Mughals. Many of the Mughals, including Akbar and Babur, wrote autobiographies. They established vast libraries. There were some downsides to it, and then they were so cosmopolitan. Many were addicted to alcohol, opium, and women. Also, the Mughals, even early on, established this practice by which the sons revolt against their father for their inheritance. So the only way you rule the Mughal Empire is to prove that the current ruler doesn't deserve to rule it anymore. So they go into revolt against their fathers. And this is a pretty destructive practice. It leads to warfare on the countryside, civil war, regular civil wars amongst the Mughals, which of course their enemies would eventually take advantage of. It's not uncommon amongst all the Gunpowder Empires to kill the sons off to secure a straight line of succession. The Ottoman Turks were notoriously bad. They often, to make sure that only one person came to rule and there wasn't a succession crisis, they killed off all the other the heirs. But this revolting is really hard on the Mughals. The most famous cases, of course, Akbar's son, Salim, also known as Jahangir. He revolts in 1598 and 1605. He takes the throne and then fights his rival siblings for another decade to show that he is the top Mughal prince or ruler, or emperor at this point, Shah. The fall of the Mughals would happen, of course, as a result of the British East India Company. British East India Company established in 1600. It's allowed access to the Mughal Empire by Jahangir in 1612. So in many ways, the seeds of the destruction of the Mughal Empire is very early on, but it's not really until the Battle of Buxar in 1764 that you have the Mughal acknowledged British rule over much of the territory. And the Mughal Empire was not actually dissolved until 1857 as part of the Sepoy Mutiny. All right. I do want to leave some time for questions, but I do want to briefly point out that these were not the only Islamic states of the period. So whereas I've talked to this point about the concept of gunpowder empires and even some broad information about all three of these empires, I want to take a step back and look at what some of these other Islamic empires looked like during this time period. Some of these capitalized on gunpowder weaponry, and many fought with the nations of Europe. So these were very important Islamic states. All these were very important in their own right, even if they're not classified necessarily as gunpowder empires. The first one, of course, is the Songhai. Songhai were located in West Africa. They were the last of the great West African empires. Their capital was in Gao. Some people criticize the Songhai, whereas Mali, in particular, had been really devout Muslims in many ways. Gao's almost seen as a backslide towards paganism in many ways. However, it did have the great learning center, Islamic learning center of Timbuktu. This empire was eventually destroyed by the Moroccans at the Battle of Tondibi in 1591. And you can see them here. You'll notice most of the states actually located along the Niger River, but also portions of the Senegal River and the, oh God, I'm not going to remember that other river right off the top of my head, but that's all right. Just to give you an idea that, obviously if you want to learn more about these people, there's a lot of literature out there on the Songhai. The people who destroyed them are often sometimes referred to as early modern Morocco or the Saadian Empire. This empire was ruled by the Saudi dynasty from about 1509 to 1649. Interestingly enough, they don't follow the model of Sunni, Shia, and the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, in the sense that they actually adopt firearms primarily through Portuguese and Spanish interactions. In fact, they fight the Ottomans at the Battle of Tadla in 1554, winning a great victory for them. They actually kill the Portuguese king at the Battle of Alsair Kabir in 1578. That leads to the Spanish and Portuguese uniting under the Habsburgs for some period of time in the Portuguese succession crisis. And then, of course, they defeat the Songhai at the Battle of Tondibi in 1591. Other states in Africa, other important Islamic states in Africa, we'd be remiss if not to mention the Ajuran Empire. This is early modern, one of the states that represents what is today Somalia. This was this kingdom, which was primarily based on taxing commerce along the Indian Ocean, on trade routes, as well as piracy. I should say they taxed trade, but they also were notorious pirates. This state really got going in the 16th century, largely due to the influx of Spanish Muslims, Arabs, and North Africans that fled both Spain, but the Spanish reconquest, but also the Ottoman conquest of North Africa. Even though these guys would eventually be armed by the Ottoman Turks, they established their own empire. They primarily fight with the Portuguese for control of East Africa. You can actually see the Portuguese Empire just to the south of them. They also fought to some extent with Christian Ethiopia, which is located in those highlands between the Ajurans and the Adal Sultanate. Going outside of Africa, this one I'm not going to even try to pronounce. I think it's called Ase. However, this state here is often looked at as the porch of Mecca. Like the Mughals, like the Adurans, they were largely supplied by the Ottoman Turks. In essence, their state was initially established as state-sponsored piracy against the Portuguese and Dutch colonies, but this represents the start of modern-day Indonesia. There was a big push in the early modern empire for Islam to push and continue to push through through Southeastern Asia, and one of those states that was considered very important in this was this state here. They largely used boats or xebics, supplied by the Ottomans for their raids, but they are being equipped with large numbers of firearms and large numbers of cannon to make that a reality. Lastly, I'd be remiss if I don't talk about at least one Islamic state in Central Asia. There was many of them, the Uzbeks and so forth. Perhaps the most famous or problematic to Eastern European peoples during this time period. Well, I guess I'm not going to talk about the Crimean Khanate. I apologize, but the Kazakh Khanate was very, very large. In fact, this represents the precursor to the modern Kazakhstan, which exists today. Most of you probably most famously know Kazakhstan, not for anything that really happened there, but the amazing Borat, who supposedly came from Kazakhstan, which is a horrible misinformation campaign on what Kazakh people believes. But the economy of the Kazakhs was actually more terrifying in many ways. They're seen as humorous in the Borat movies, but really their economy was based on raiding Slavic populations in Russia and selling those slaves into Central Asia. Unlike many of the other kingdoms that we're talking about here, their army composed almost exclusively of horse archers. So they're an example of a state that never brought, that really wasn't a gunpowder empire, but still proved to be militarily very important, even though it practiced a model that had been in existence since the medieval period in earlier times, obviously. In fact, it was incorporated in the Kazakh Khanate. It actually collapses in 1847 and is incorporated in the Russian Empire. Of course, recently, in recent times, we've seen how it served as the modern day precedent for the country of Kazakhstan. Oh, I went the wrong way. So I got some conclusions I want to end with, and then I do want to open it up for some questions. First and foremost, if you noticed anything about what I said, what I didn't talk about was the Middle East and Egypt. And that's because during the early modern era, unfortunately, these areas of Islam became almost peripheral to the Islamic world. In fact, by this point, early modern period, it's important to note that Arab speaking peoples were a minority and are still a minority today of Arabic peoples are a minority in the Islamic population. In fact, the most populous Islamic nation in the world, I think today, is Indonesia. And I think it's followed by Pakistan, but somebody can correct me on that if I'm wrong. It may be Bangladesh. Arabs represent the minority and not in politically control of the most prominent Islamic states. And it's also important to note that while history tends to focus on those three large gunpowder empires, there were many other Islamic states during this time period that were equally successful in many ways. What the Gunpowder Empire's success really kind of boils down to is technological superiority. They were really good with firearms early on. Dynamic leaders also played a role in this rapid expansion. I don't think you could have had the Gunpowder Empires without people such as Mehmed the Conqueror or Abbas the Great or the ever-conquering Babur. Who hated India but ended up leaving the legacy to his offspring. He actually complained in his book that he didn't like India because they didn't have ice there, and there's nothing better than having I think it was fresh melon squeezed on the ice. I think what he's really trying to say is like some sort of sherbet. He really liked his sherbet, and he couldn't get that in India, which really bothered him. And these empires focus their conquest much more on neighboring Islamic states and Western Christendom. It's very easy, especially if you go to like Poland today, to see the Ottoman Turks as like these boogeymen of Europe, and that they fought so much with the Europeans, and that they were the greatest threat to the Europeans. Certainly when I talk about them, obviously in relationship to Spain or in relationship to Germany, that seems to be the case. But it's important to note that these three Islamic empires spent most of their time fighting other Islamic states, and each other, not necessarily Europe. So sometimes they get a bad rap in that way. More importantly, these legacies of these empires are still with us today. If you look at the battle lines for Sunni and Shia peoples, they follow along those Ottoman Turk and Ottoman and Safavid boundaries today, with the most contested space, of course, being Iraq, where both of these places coveted. But also this forms the foundation of Pakistani and Bengali relations with Indian peoples, are largely governed today by perceptions of past Mughal conquests. In fact, it's important to note that while the successor states of these gunpowder empires, which are Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan, are still great military powers, and at least one of them, Pakistan, is confirmed to have a nuclear arsenal. In fact, strangely enough, and I might be saying this, I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure they named their nuclear weapon after those Mughal conquerors. I'm pretty sure that missile that you see there, which I think is supposed to be a nuclear missile, though I don't know if it is. I pulled that image off the internet. I don't know if that's a Babur or not. But the reality is, if Pakistan goes to war with India, they're going to fire a Babur at them. Which means tiger, right? But it's also in reference to their early Mughal conqueror, who decimated the Indian forces. You can see there's a symbolic nature to that. I could have that partially wrong. I'd be lying if I said I understood Pakistan military procedures today, but we can see Pakistan there in the image, and certainly they are a military power. Turkey is also, and Iran are also. We hear all the time about their growing influence in the region. And I think it's completely valid to see them as the successor states for these gunpowder empires. I think there are things in the chat now, so I will stop sharing. But always you can ask me questions about these groups. And I hope that I've shared some different information with you today that you may not know in the past. Julia Myers asked, this is not necessarily related. It's sort of related, but it's not directly related. Is it true that the word slave comes from the fact that Slavs were enslaved in early times? Yes. Unfortunately, here's the difference, though, before you start blaming Islam for it. A lot of the people that took Slavs as slaves were other European peoples. In fact, probably the most notorious of it were your Scandinavian peoples. So it's important to note that yes, Slavic peoples were taken as slaves by a lot of different populations, have been historically treated very badly. And I'm not of Slavic ancestry. I'm not saying this to have a pity party on me. Slavic peoples have been historically ill-treated by both Germanic peoples, by Scandinavian peoples, by other Slavic peoples, as well as Arabic and Turkic peoples. So, that's hard. It's a hard pill for many Slavic nations to swallow. Other questions, though?
Yeah, you mentioned a term earlier about the Janissaries. I know that word came into the New World through what we have now, the Genízaros. Could you elaborate more on how that term came to be here?
We will be talking. Yep. So that's good, Ron. I'm not going to talk about it too much today, other than to say you're absolutely right. And that our next talk, which talks about the indigenous conquest of the New World, will specifically talk about how that word, the Janissaries, come to represent how the Turkish model of fighting in some weird, perverse way ends up in New Mexico in the 16th or 17th and 18th centuries. So we will be talking about that next time, but that is part of another talk. But it's good that you recognize that that's where it comes from. It's also important to note, well, because we are the Friends of Coronado Historic Site, it's also important to note one of the more dehumanizing terms used for Native Americans during Coronado's time even is to name the Pawnee man, nickname him the Turk. I mean, if you look at the accounts, they do some pretty terrible things to the Native American they called a Turk. That is obviously, that dehumanizing characteristic is largely due that the use of that term to dehumanize that person is likely associated with their view of Turkish peoples as a whole, but specifically the Ottomans. But we will talk about how Janissary, how the Ottoman model for conscripting young Christian boys gets twisted into the model we have in New Mexico in our next lecture. So I'm going to talk about it. You just have to wait 2 weeks. Other questions?
That's fine. But the second question to that, with the Janissaries, were they? I know there were slaves that were brought into the military, but were they? Do you know what happened to them after they were of service? They did their service. Did they were they freed? Kind of like what happened here in New Mexico.
So I think the first concept, and there's going to be a couple different concepts, and I'll try to go through them just briefly because so I don't spend too much time on this one, but I think this is an interesting and fascinating thing. First of all, in Islam, slavery is quite a bit different. You got to remember that Islam itself is a slavery to God in many ways. So the Ottoman system is pretty much to go into these southern Slavic places. We're talking primarily Croats, Serbs, but also at this point Bulgarians, which are largely Slav population at this point. They're going into these places and they're taking these Orthodox Christian boys in tribute. These boys would have initially been raised in Orthodox Christian households or Catholic households, depending upon which group they're using. These young people would be brought into Constantinople or Edirne or any of the major Ottoman settlements in either Anatolia or in Greece or the Southern Europe, and they would be very much indoctrinated into radical Islam. So they would be converted to Islam, and then after they were indoctrinated that Islam and Sunni Islam was the only true religion, they would be trained in the use of firearms. These people were not set free. These people then became the rulers of the Ottoman Turks. So the Ottomans took these slaves and transformed them into their own rulers. And I tried to point out, and I didn't point this out, probably I did point out that even the Sultan himself is largely of Slavic descent. To say the Ottoman Turks are Turks is problematic. Even Turkey today, and I probably will get in trouble for this, but I don't view the people of Turkey, even though we call them Turks, as true Turks. If you want to see true Turks or Turkish culture, true Turkish culture, and I don't mean this as in the sense of national Turkish culture, you're better going to Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan to see true Turkish culture. The Turks are in essence, you could make the argument that they are a continuation of the Roman Empire. They are Islam. They do worship Islam, but the Roman Empire had many different religions up until this point. So it was really no different. These are, and they are also very much Europeans in many ways. And I think those are important statements about understanding the way the Ottomans worked and the way they operated as far as how they are today. And even modern day Turkey is in many ways not viewed as a radical Islamic state, even though that's where the foundation of the Ottomans might have come from. It's a moderate state, or perhaps, and people could disagree with me on this, a moderate state that in many ways functions very much like a European nation. It's very different from Saudi Arabia or even Iran today. And no comments on the current leader of Turkey.
I just wanted to comment about Akbar, who he's the one who built the Taj Mahal for his wife. Her demise and as a mausoleum for her. He also, if you go to the Taj Mahal, across the river on the other side, on the backside, there is a black Taj Mahal. It was just started. Some of the pillars are there. The main structure is never there. He intended that to be his own mausoleum, and he started that when his son deposed him. And he didn't kill his father. He just kept him in prison at the Red Fort, which is just to the south, or I think maybe to the east of the Taj Mahal. And it's a really interesting place to visit because it's a palace and it's open as a state monument. And it's not something that most people know about. You just hear about the Taj Mahal, you think it's there all by itself, but it really isn't. It's got a lot of other stuff around it that is all pertinent to the story of the Muslim sons deposing their fathers in order to take over.
Yeah, I thought the Taj Mahal was actually built by a later Mughal, but I get what you're saying.
Well,
you're probably
I could be
right on
wrong.
that.
I could be wrong. I thought
But
it was Akbar.
It might be one of the later Mughals, but it's still a very important. In fact, I've never been to India. I'd love to go someday. So if anybody's thinking about going to India and they need a tour guide that can offer fascinating Mughal facts, I'm probably not your best person. I'm sure there's people in India that know a hell of a lot more than me, but I would gladly go with you. The one thing I will say is I actually have a family connection to the area. It sounds very strange, and I know I've mentioned this to several of you before. I am pretty Anglo. I get that. I'm as white. I'm actually primarily of Italian ancestry, but and North African. But there is a subsection of my family which is all East Indian. And so they have the Barber last name and the whole 9 yards. They're actually East Indian. They're actually from their last name was Mitra, and they immigrated to America after the kind of the fall of the British Empire in India and established themselves in Massachusetts. The funny thing is I in diving down this rabbit hole, I started to learn a lot about Indian caste system, because obviously if you have a surname, you can tell what caste you are and then find out how your family would have your family members would have been in the thing. There are Kshatriyas, which in fact, Kamala Harris is Brahmin. By the way, I actually went down that rabbit hole recently. But Kshatriyas are the warrior caste of the Hindu peoples. And so the Mitra family would have been one of the groups that both fought against and fought alongside the Mughals in northern India. In fact, my specific family, even though they are of Hindu ancestry, they actually definitely fought with the Muslims. In fact, when they immigrated to the United States, in fact, my great aunt used to tell me she came from East Pakistan. And I thought that at the time, because I was confused, I thought at the time that meant the Punjab region. It doesn't. It actually means, and probably most of you that are older can think of this, East Pakistan is what they used to call Bengal. And so she was actually, even though Bengal is a Islamic state today, my Hindu family is actually from the far eastern portions of the subcontinent. But I'm not directly related. I am not a Kshatriya class or even a descendant of it. But I found it very fascinating to learn about that stuff. And then when I started to learn about how the Mughals were such diehard hunters, it just amazed me that they had large hunting palaces and they spent so much time hunting game. I thought to myself, I would really be at home there. And just a man who would say that the conquest of an entire subcontinent really didn't interest him at all because it didn't have shaved ice desserts is truly a man that I would have liked to known and shaken his hand, because he loved arts. He wrote his own thoughts down. He obviously, these Mughal emperors, regardless of whether you see them as barbarians, as Islamic barbarians, or interlopers in India, and certainly they were conquerors to many of the Hindu people. They also gave Hindu peoples jobs and positions in their court and so on. And they really seem to have been very I would think that based upon their writings, they were very self-aware of their own needs and interests. Even if they pursued sometimes not the best strategies towards preserving their legacy, they were very interesting. And the fact that they wrote down so much of what they did and what they thought is an amazing legacy to leave behind. It's also important to note that when we're talking about military conquerors of the age, and I just got done talking about European conquerors, that in many ways, in fact, Babur's conquest of the Sultanate of Delhi is certainly an example. In many ways, the conquests that some of these Islamic rulers made far outsurpassed the achievements of our more known Western European rulers and generals of the same time period. Some of their conquests were absolutely amazing and stunning and deserve Babur probably deserves a place, if not not next to Adolphus Gustavus of Sweden. He might even stand above him. He may even stand in some of his ways even above his greater legacies of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, in the sense that he truly won some miraculous battles in his own name. And even he was amazed at how well he did. He didn't believe he could win that battle, and he did it and beat him and got a kingdom as a result. All right, I will do one more question, and then we're already over time. And if anybody else has a question, I'll do one more. No? All right. Have a nice evening, guys. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back with Native American conquistadors and talking about the whole Janissary thing in New Mexico next time.
Matt.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, Matt.